The Imperial transport ship descended through clouds of pale violet gas, and Marcus Cole pressed his face against a viewing window, like a child seeing snow for the first time in his life. He had traveled for 7 months through the cold emptiness of space to reach this world, and now the capital city of the Velthari Empire spread beneath him like a dream made real, and solid towers of crystalline blue stone rose toward the sky and caught the light of 3 distant suns and shattered it into rainbows that danced across the city streets below. Marcus had seen many alien worlds during his career as a diplomat, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scale and beauty of Velthari's prime, and he felt his heart beating faster with excitement. And with fear, the ship touched down on a landing platform made of some smooth white material that hummed beneath his feet when he stepped onto it. And a delegation of Velthari officials waited to receive him with their forearms folded across their narrow chests. The Velthari were tall beings with skin the color of moonlight and eyes like pools of liquid silver, and they moved with a grace that made Marcus feel clumsy and heavy and primitive in comparison. The lead official was a female named Counselor Thess, and she greeted Marcus with words that his translator device rendered as formally polite, but her tone suggested something closer to bored tolerance. "Welcome, Ambassador Cole of Earth," she said, "and we hope your journey was not too difficult for your species." Marcus smiled and thanked her and pretended not to notice the subtle insult hidden in her words, because he had been warned about this, and he had prepared himself for much worse. Humanity had only made contact with the greater galactic community 15 years ago, and in that time humans had earned a reputation as curious and persistent, and sometimes annoying creatures who refused to stay in their proper place. The Velthari Empire had ruled this sector of space for 10,000 years, and they viewed humans as newcomers who had barely learned to walk among the stars, and who should be grateful for any attention they received. Marcus followed Counselor Thess through the winding corridors of the Imperial Palace, and he tried to memorize the route, but soon gave up because the passages twisted and turned in ways that seemed to defy logic and reason. The walls were covered with murals that depicted the history of the Velthari Empire, and Marcus saw images of great battles and peaceful treaties, and the faces of queens who had ruled for centuries before humans had even invented writing. They passed through gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names in any human language, and fountains sprayed water that sparkled with bioluminescent organisms that glowed like tiny stars. Other delegates from other species walked these same corridors, and Marcus recognized some of them from the briefings he had studied during his long journey through space. The Kethri were small creatures covered in soft brown fur with large eyes that seemed to see everything at once, and they served the Empire as cooks and servants and performed other tasks that the proud Velthari considered beneath their dignity. The Morvathi were massive beings with thick gray skin and 4 powerful legs, and they had been conquered by the Empire 3,000 years ago, and now served as soldiers and guards and enforcers of imperial law. A group of Sylvani drifted past, and their bodies were made of something that looked like living glass, and they communicated through patterns of light that flickered across their translucent forms, and Marcus found them beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Counselor Thess led Marcus to his quarters and informed him that the Grand Concordance would begin in 3 days, and that he was expected to attend all official functions and to present tribute from Earth to Queen Seraphiel herself. Marcus thanked her again and watched her leave, and then he sat down on the edge of his bed and let out a long breath that he had not realized he was holding. The room was large and comfortable, and decorated in shades of blue and silver, and a window offered a view of the city that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Marcus opened his luggage and began unpacking his formal clothes and the gifts he had brought from Earth, and he thought about the responsibility that rested on his shoulders. He was the first human to ever attend the Grand Concordance, and the first human to ever stand in the presence of the Velthari Queen, and everything he did and said would shape how the Empire viewed humanity for generations to come. The Grand Concordance was a ceremony that happened only once every 100 years, and during this feast, the Queen received tribute from all the vassal species and renewed the alliances that held the Empire together. It was a time of celebration and politics and subtle maneuvering as different factions competed for the Queen's favor and tried to improve their standing in the complex hierarchy of imperial society. Marcus had been told to watch and listen and learn, and to avoid making any mistakes that might embarrass Earth or damage humanity's fragile relationship with the Empire. He had been told to be humble and quiet, and to accept whatever treatment he received without complaint, because humans were not important enough to have opinions that mattered. But Marcus had never been very good at following instructions, and he had a curious nature that had gotten him into trouble more than once during his career as a diplomat. He spent the next 2 days exploring the palace and wandering through corridors where he probably should not have gone, and talking to servants who were surprised that any delegate would speak to them. The other diplomats kept to their quarters or gathered in formal reception halls where they engaged in careful conversations filled with hidden meanings and veiled threats and promises that might or might not be kept. Marcus found these gatherings boring and exhausting, and he preferred to spend his time in the kitchens and workshops where the real work of the palace happened. Servants were suspicious of him at first, because no one of importance had ever shown interest in their lives or their work, but slowly they began to warm to him. He learned their names and asked about their families and listened to their complaints and their hopes, and he discovered that beneath the glittering surface of the imperial court, there was a whole world that the powerful never bothered to see. On the evening before the Grand Concordance was to begin, Marcus stood on a balcony and watched the 3 suns set behind the distant mountains and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who was 12 years old and waiting for him back on Earth, and he wondered what she would think if she could see this alien sunset. He had promised her that he would come home safely and that he would bring her a gift from the Volthari homeworld, and he intended to keep that promise no matter what happened. The feast would begin tomorrow, and Marcus would play his small part in the ceremony, and then he would return to Earth and resume his ordinary life and probably never see this world again. But standing there on that balcony with the alien wind on his face and the sounds of the imperial city rising up around him, Marcus felt a strange sense of unease that he could not explain. Something was wrong, and he could feel it in his bones, the way a sailor can feel a storm approaching long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. He shook his head and told himself that he was being foolish and that his imagination was playing tricks on him. After months of isolation in space, tomorrow would be a day of celebration and ceremony, and there was nothing to fear from a feast where 100 species would gather to honor their queen. Marcus went inside and closed the window and tried to sleep, but his dreams were troubled by shadows that moved in the corners of his vision and whispers that he could not quite hear. When morning came, he dressed in his finest clothes and prepared himself to face whatever the day might bring, and he had no idea that before the feast was over, he would make a choice that would change the course of history. The Grand Concordance was about to begin, and the fate of empires would hang on decisions made by beings who did not yet know the danger that lurked in the heart of the palace. And Marcus Cole, the human ambassador from a primitive world on the edge of known space, would find himself standing at the center of events that would echo through the galaxy for 1,000 years to come. The morning of the Grand Concordance arrived with the sound of bells ringing across the imperial city, and Marcus woke to find servants already preparing his quarters for the day ahead. He dressed quickly and ate the breakfast that had been left for him, and then he found himself with several hours to spare before the first official ceremony would begin. The other diplomats were gathering in the main reception hall to practice their speeches and rehearse the proper protocols for addressing the Queen, but Marcus had no speech to give, and no protocol to follow. He was expected to stand in the back of the crowd and watch, and say nothing, and present his small tribute when his turn came, and then disappear back into obscurity. This suited Marcus fine because he had never enjoyed formal ceremonies, and he found the endless rules of diplomatic etiquette exhausting and often pointless. Instead of joining the other delegates, he decided to take one more walk through the parts of the palace where important people never went. He made his way down to the lower levels where the kitchens and storerooms and servant quarters were located and where the real work of preparing for the feast was happening. The corridors here were narrower and less decorated than the ones above, and the air was thick with the smells of cooking food and burning fuel and the sweat of workers who had been laboring since before dawn. Marcus passed groups of Kethri servants carrying baskets of vegetables and crates of exotic ingredients, and they looked at him with confusion because no delegate had ever wandered down here before. He smiled and nodded and tried to stay out of their way, and eventually he found himself in the main kitchen where hundreds of cooks were preparing the feast that would feed 1,000 guests. Kitchen was a vast chamber filled with cooking fires and preparation tables and strange devices that Marcus could not identify, and the noise was tremendous as workers shouted. Orders and pots bubbled and knives chopped and flames roared. A young Kethri cook nearly collided with Marcus as she rushed past carrying a tray of delicate pastries, and she stopped and stared at him with her large brown eyes. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was high and nervous. "And I did not see you standing there." Marcus laughed and told her that it was his fault for being in the way and that he should not be wandering around where he did not belong. The Kethri tilted her head in a gesture that Marcus had learned meant curiosity, and she asked him why he was down here in the kitchens when all the other important people were upstairs. Marcus shrugged and said that he was not really an important person and that he found the kitchens more interesting than the reception halls. The Kethri laughed at this, and the sound was like small bells ringing, and she told Marcus that her name was Yillis and that she had worked in the imperial kitchens for 5 years. They talked for a while, and Marcus learned that Yillis had been born on a farming world on the edge of Kethri territory, and that she had come to the capital hoping to learn from the greatest chefs in the empire. She was young and eager and full of dreams, and she reminded Marcus of his daughter Sarah, who also had big plans for her future. Yillis seemed surprised that Marcus treated her as an equal and asked her questions about her life and actually listened to her answers. "The other delegates never speak to servants," she said, "and they look through us as if we are invisible." Marcus told her that where he came from, people believed that everyone deserved respect regardless of their job or their species or their place in society. Said that humans must be very strange creatures, and Marcus agreed that this was probably true. As they talked, Marcus watched the controlled chaos of the kitchen and noticed the way different teams of cooks worked on different dishes and how supervisors moved between stations, checking quality and timing. He noticed that one corner of the kitchen was separated from the rest by a wall of glass, and inside that special area, a small team of senior cooks worked on dishes that looked more elaborate than anything else being prepared. "That is the ceremonial kitchen," Yillis explained, "and only the most trusted cooks are allowed to work there." Marcus asked what made those dishes special, and Yillis told him that they were preparing the sacred foods that would be served only to the queen herself. These dishes had religious significance and were prepared according to ancient recipes that have been passed down for thousands of years, and only the queen was permitted to taste them. The most important of these was the Vetserai, a dish that symbolized the bond between the queen and her people, and consuming it was the central ritual of the Grand Concordance. Marcus watched the ceremonial kitchen for a while and noticed that security around it was tight with Morvathi guards, checking everyone who entered or left. He also noticed something else that seemed odd to him. One of the senior cooks, a Velthari with pale skin and silver eyes, kept looking over his shoulder as if he was worried about being watched. and his movements seemed nervous and hurried. Marcus mentioned this to Yillis, and she glanced at the ceremonial kitchen and shrugged, and said that everyone was nervous today because the pressure of cooking for the queen was immense. "That is Senior Chef Varus," she said, "and he has been acting strange for the past few days. But I assumed it was just the stress of the occasion." Marcus nodded and tried to dismiss his concerns, but something about the way Varus moved bothered him in a way he could not quite explain. Thanked Yillis for talking with him and told her that he hoped she would achieve her dreams of becoming a great chef. Someday Yillis smiled and said that she hoped he would enjoy the feast and that she was glad to have met a human because she had heard they were unpleasant creatures, but he seemed nice enough. Marcus laughed and made his way back up to the main levels of the palace and tried to focus on the ceremonies that were about to begin, but his mind kept returning to the ceremonial kitchen and to Senior Chef Varus and to the nervous energy that had seemed to surround him over the next several hours. Marcus attended the opening ceremonies of the Grand Concordance and stood in the back of the great hall and watched as Delegate after Delegate approached the throne and offered tribute to Queen Seraphiel. The queen was ancient beyond human comprehension, and her skin was so pale it was almost transparent, and her eyes glowed with a soft silver light that seemed to see into the hearts of everyone who stood before her. She received each tribute with grace and spoke words of welcome to each species and renewed the bonds of alliance that held her empire together. Marcus watched and listened and learned, and he noticed the way different factions within the court maneuvered for position, and how subtle gestures and careful words carried meanings that only those who understood the game could recognize. He noticed that some delegates seemed nervous and others seemed confident, and a few seemed to be watching the proceedings with an intensity that suggested they were waiting for something specific to happen. When Marcus' turn came, he walked forward and presented his tribute, which was a collection of art and music and literature from Earth, and he spoke the simple words of greeting that he had been taught. The queen looked at him with those ancient silver eyes, and Marcus felt as if she was examining his soul and finding it curious, but not particularly important. "Welcome, human," she said, "and your species is young, but we shall see what you become." Marcus bowed and retreated, and that was the end of his official role in the ceremony. But he stayed and watched as the final tributes were presented, and the opening feast was announced as the crowd began moving toward the feasting halls. Marcus slipped away and made his way back down to the kitchens because he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He found Yillis working at a preparation station, and she looked surprised to see him again. "So soon? I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to trust me even though we have only just met." Yillis looked at him with those large brown eyes, and Marcus could see that she was uncertain, but also curious. "What do you need to know?" she asked. Marcus took a deep breath and asked her to tell him everything she knew about Senior Chef Varus and about anything unusual that had happened in the ceremonial kitchen over the past few days. And as Yillis began to talk, Marcus felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. Yillis spoke quietly as she continued her work, and Marcus listened carefully to every word she said. Senior Chef Varus had been acting strangely for about 2 weeks, she told him, and at first she had thought he was simply nervous about the responsibility of preparing the sacred dishes. But then she had noticed other things that seemed harder to explain. Varus and requested a change in the ingredient suppliers for certain rare spices, and he had insisted on personally inspecting every delivery before anyone else could see. I had also been meeting with people who did not belong in the kitchen area, and Yillis had seen him talking with a Velthari noble in a shadowy corridor late one night, and just yesterday, one of the junior cooks who worked in the ceremonial kitchen had been reassigned to a different part of the palace without explanation. These things might mean nothing, Yillis said, and I do not want to accuse anyone of wrongdoing without proof. Marcus thanked her for the information and asked if there was any way he could get closer to the ceremonial kitchen without being noticed. Dylas looked at him with worry in her large eyes and asked why he wanted to do something so dangerous. Marcus was not sure how to explain the feeling that had been growing in his chest since he first saw Vareth looking over his shoulder with that nervous expression. He told Euless that he had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and that right now his instincts were telling him that something bad was going to happen. Euless was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded and said that she would help him because she had also been feeling uneasy, but had been too afraid to say anything. She led Marcus through a series of back corridors and storage rooms until they reached a small alcove that looked into the ceremonial kitchen through a gap in the glass wall. From here, Marcus could see the senior cooks working on the sacred dishes, and he could see Vareth standing at a preparation table with his back to the room. The Veth Sarai was being assembled on a golden plate, and it was a beautiful creation of delicate ingredients, arranged in patterns that had religious significance. Marcus watched Vareth carefully and noticed that the chef kept his body positioned to block the view of what he was doing from the other cooks. And then Marcus caught a smell that made his blood run cold. It was faint and brief, but unmistakable, and it triggered a memory that he had buried deep in his mind for many years. When Marcus was a young man, he had worked on a frontier colony world that had been plagued by pirates and raiders who attacked isolated settlements. One of those raiders had used a poison called Varic 7 to contaminate water supplies, and Marcus had been present when colonial authorities had investigated one of the addicts. Varic 7 had a distinctive smell that was almost undetectable to most species, but human noses were unusually sensitive to certain chemical compounds. The smell lasted only for a moment, and then it was gone, but Marcus was certain of what he had detected. Someone had just added Varic 7 or something very similar to the sacred dish that would be served to the queen. Marcus pulled back from the alcove, and his heart was pounding, and his hands were shaking, and he tried to think clearly about what he should do. He told Euless what he had smelled and what it meant, and her face went pale beneath her brown fur. "We have to tell someone," she said, "and we have to stop them." Marcus agreed, but he knew that it would not be easy to convince anyone to listen to him. Was a human and a newcomer, and he had no status or authority in this place, and he was accusing a senior chef and possibly a noble faction of plotting to assassinate the queen. He made his way up to the main level of the palace and found the captain of the queen's personal guard and requested an urgent audience. The captain was a Morvathi named Thorax, and he was large and intimidating, and he looked at Marcus with obvious contempt. "What does the human want?" he asked, "and I am very busy with security for the feast." Marcus explained what he had seen and what he had smelled, and he tried to convey the urgency of the situation. Thorax listened with growing impatience, and when Marcus finished speaking, the captain let out a sound that might have been laughter. "You are telling me," he said, "that you smell poison in a kitchen from a distance of several meters through a glass wall?" Marcus said yes. That was exactly what he was telling him. Thorax shook his massive head and said that humans were known for their wild imaginations and their tendency to see threats where none existed. "Your species smells emotions," the captain said with contempt in his voice, "and now you claim to smell poison as well." Marcus tried to explain about Varic 7 and about the frontier colony and about how human noses worked, but Thorax was not interested in listening. "I will not disrupt the Grand Concordance because a primitive creature had a bad feeling," the captain said, "and now leave before I have you arrested for wasting my time." Marcus was escorted away from the guard station, and he stood in a corridor and tried to think of another option. He sought out the human delegation and found Ambassador Chun, who was the senior human diplomat and who had been his supervisor for this mission. Chun listened to Marcus with a frown on his face, and when Marcus finished speaking, the older man shook his head. "You have no proof," Chun said, "and you are asking me to make accusations against the Velthari court based on something you think you smelled." Marcus insisted that he was certain, and that they had to do something before it was. Too late. Chen told Marcus that he understood his concern, but that the risk was too great. If we accuse them of plotting against the Queen, and we are wrong, Chen said, then humanity will be expelled from the Empire, and everything we have worked for will be destroyed. Chen ordered Marcus to return to his quarters and to stay there until the feast was over, and to speak to no one about his suspicions. This is not a suggestion, Chen said, and this is a direct order from your superior. Marcus wanted to argue, but he could see that Chen would not be moved, and so he nodded and walked away, but he had no intention of obeying that order. He returned to the lower levels and found Yillis and told her what had happened. She looked frightened and said that perhaps they should just let it go and hope that Marcus had been mistaken. Marcus understood her fear, but he could not walk away from this. If the Queen dies tonight, he said, then millions of people could suffer in the chaos that follows, and I cannot live with that knowledge. If I could have prevented it. Tullis was quiet for a long moment, and then she squared her small shoulders and said that she would help him. Even though she was afraid, what do we do next? She asked. Marcus told her that they needed proof, and that the only way to get proof was to examine the Vethsarai directly before it was served to the Queen. Yillis said that was impossible because the ceremonial dishes were guarded constantly, and no one could get close to them without authorization. Marcus smiled and said that impossible was just another word for difficult, and that humans had a long history of doing difficult things. They began to plan, and the hours until the feast were slipping away, and somewhere in the ceremonial kitchen a poisoned dish waited to be served to a queen who had no idea that she was about to die. Marcus and Yillis spent the next hour gathering information and trying to find a way into the ceremonial kitchen without being caught. Yillis knew the schedules of the guards and the routines of the kitchen staff, and she helped Marcus identify the best moment to make their move. The opportunity came when a shift change left a brief gap in the security around the ceremonial area. Marcus slipped through a service entrance and found himself in a narrow corridor that led to a storage room connected to the ceremonial kitchen. He could hear the sounds of the cooks working on the other side of the wall, and he could smell the exotic ingredients that were being used to prepare the sacred dishes. The storage room was filled with containers of rare spices and preserved ingredients, and Marcus moved carefully between the shelves until he found what he was looking for. A corner of the room, hidden behind a stack of empty crates, was a small container that did not match the others. Marcus opened it and found a crystalline powder that had no smell but left a faint residue on his fingers that made his skin tingle. This was not Varric 7, but it was something similar, and Marcus realized that whoever had planned this assassination had gone to great lengths to obtain a poison that would be undetectable by Velthari senses. Took a small sample of the powder and sealed it in a container that he had brought with him, and then he made his way back out of the storage room. Yillis was waiting for him in the corridor, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Did you find something?" she asked. Marcus showed her the sample and explained what he believed it was, and Yillis covered her mouth with her small hands. "What do we do now?" she asked, "and who can we show this to?" Marcus thought about the problem and realized that he needed someone with the authority to stop the feast and the willingness to listen to a human with wild accusations. He remembered seeing a Velthari official earlier in the day who had seemed different from the others and who had looked at Marcus with something that might have been curiosity rather than contempt. Her name was High Counselor Revith, and she was one of the Queen's closest advisors, and she had a reputation for being fair and thoughtful. Marcus asked Yillis if she knew how to find the High Counselor, and Yillis said that Revith had quarters in the eastern wing of the palace. They made their way through the corridors, and Marcus tried to look like he belonged there even though his heart was pounding and his hands were sweating. They reached the eastern wing, and Marcus approached the guards outside Revith's quarters and requested an audience. The guards were suspicious, but Marcus insisted that he had information of vital importance to the security of the Queen. After a long wait, the door opened, and High Counselor Rivas stood there looking at Marcus with those silver, Valkyrie eyes. "You are the human ambassador," she said, "and what could you possibly have to tell me that would be worth interrupting my preparations for the feast?" Marcus took a deep breath and told her everything he told her about Vorath and the strange behavior and the smell in the kitchen and the powder he had found hidden in the storage room. Ravith listened without interrupting, and her expression did not change, but Marcus could see that she was taking his words seriously. When he finished, she held out her hand, and Marcus gave her the container with the sample of powder. She examined it carefully, and then she went to a device on her desk and placed a small amount of the powder inside. The device hummed for a moment, and then displayed results that made Ravith's face go pale. "This is selenith," she said, "and it is a poison that has been banned in the Empire for 2,000 years. Marcus asked what selenith would do to someone who consumed it. Ravith said that it would cause a slow deterioration of the internal organs that would appear to be natural aging, and that the victim would die within a few months without ever knowing they had been poisoned. It is the perfect assassination weapon," she said, "and the queen would never know she had been murdered." Ravith was silent for a moment, and then she looked at Marcus with an expression that was hard to read. "Why did you bring this to me?" she asked, "and you could have simply returned to your quarters and let events unfold." Marcus thought about the question and realized that he did not have a complicated answer. "I saw something wrong," he said, "and I could not walk away from it, and that is not how humans are mad." Ravith studied him for a long moment, and then she nodded. "I believe you," she said, but we have a problem." She explained that the feast was about to begin, and that the Vethsarai would be served to the queen as the climax of the ceremony. If she tried to stop the feast without solid proof, then the conspirators would destroy the evidence and escape, and they would simply try again another day. "We need to catch them in the act," she said, "and we need to expose them in front of the entire court so that there can be no doubt about their guilt." Marcus asked what she wanted him to do. Ravith said that she needed time to position her loyal guards and to prepare for the confrontation. She asked Marcus to return to the feast and to watch and to be ready to act if something went wrong. "But you must not interfere," she warned, "and if you disrupt the ceremony before I am ready, then everything will be ruined." Marcus agreed and made his way back to the main level of the palace and found a place in the great hall where the feast was being held. The room was magnificent and filled with representatives of 100 species, and the air was thick with the sounds of conversation and music and the smells of exotic foods. Marcus watched and waited and tried to remain calm, even though every nerve in his body was screaming that time was running out. He saw Vorath in the distance directing the servers who would bring the sacred dishes to the queen, and he saw the cold satisfaction in the chef's silver eyes. He saw nobles gathered in groups and whispering to each other, and he wondered which of them were part of the conspiracy. And then he saw something that made his blood freeze. 2 guards were moving through the crowd toward him, and their eyes were fixed on his face with unmistakable purpose. Someone had discovered what he had done, and someone had sent these guards to stop him. Before he could interfere with their plans, Marcus turned and tried to slip away through the crowd, but more guards were blocking the exits, and he realized that he was trapped. A hand grabbed his arm, and a voice spoke in his ear. "You are under arrest," it said, for threatening the peace of the solver. Marcus tried to protest, but the guards were already dragging him away, and the feast was continuing without him, and the Vethsarai was being prepared for its final presentation to the queen. He had been so close to stopping the assassination, and now he was being taken to a cell where he would wait helplessly while a queen was murdered and an empire was thrown into chaos. But Marcus Cole had never been good at giving up, and as the guards dragged him through the corridors of the palace, he was already planning his escape. The holding cell was small and cold, and made of the same white material that seemed to cover every surface in the Volthari Palace. Marcus sat on a bench and stared at the door and tried to think of a way out. The guards had taken his communication device and his identification, and anything else that might have helped him call for assistance. He was alone and trapped, and the feast was continuing somewhere above him, and the Queen was about to be murdered. Marcus thought about his daughter Sarah, and the promise he had made to come home safely, and he wondered if he would ever see her again. He thought about the choice he had made to investigate the kitchen, instead of staying in his quarters, where he belonged. Thought about High Counselor Raveth and wondered if she was even now preparing to expose the conspiracy, or if she had been part of it all along. The uncertainty was the worst part, because Marcus had no way of knowing what was happening and no way of affecting the outcome. He stood up and examined the cell more carefully and looked for any weakness he might exploit. Walls were solid, and the door was sealed with some kind of energy barrier that hummed softly when he approached it. But Marcus noticed something that the builders of this cell had probably not considered: the ventilation system. There was a grate in the ceiling that allowed air to flow into the cell, and Marcus realized that the Velthari who had designed this space had not expected to ever hold a human prisoner. Humans were smaller than most Velthari and more flexible, and Marcus had spent his youth climbing through maintenance shafts on colony ships and space stations. He dragged the bench to the center of the room and stood on it and reached up to examine the grate. It was secured with simple fasteners that were designed to be removed for maintenance, and Marcus used his belt buckle to turn them. Dictamoise. Grate came loose, and Marcus pulled himself up into the ventilation shaft with muscles that burned from the effort. The shaft was tight and dark, and filled with dust that made him want to cough. But Marcus forced himself to move slowly, and quietly he crawled through the darkness and followed the flow of air and tried to remember the layout of the palace from his explorations over the past few days. The shafts branched and twisted, and Marcus made choices based on instinct and luck and the faint sounds that filtered through the metal walls. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, he found another grate that looked down into a corridor. He could see guards walking past and servants hurrying to and fro, and he recognized this as one of the passages that led to the great hall. Marcus waited until the corridor was empty, and then he pushed out the grate and dropped down to the floor. His legs buckled when he landed, and he had to brace himself against the wall to keep from falling. He was covered in dust, and his formal clothes were torn and dirty, and he looked nothing like a diplomat attending a royal feast. But appearance did not matter anymore, because time was running out and Marcus had a choice to make. He could try to find High Counselor Raveth and hope that she had everything under control, or he could go to the human embassy and let Ambassador Chun know what was happening and let someone else take responsibility, or he could go to the feast hall himself and try to stop the assassination, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Marcus stood in that corridor and thought about his options, and he knew in his heart that there was only one choice he could live with. Had seen the poison with his own eyes, and he had held it in his hands, and he knew what would happen if the Queen consumed the Veths. Are millions of beings across 100 worlds depended on the stability of the Velthari Empire, and if the Queen died tonight, that stability would shatter. Wars would be fought, and alliances would crumble, and innocent people would suffer and die in the chaos that followed. Marcus thought about Sarah again, and about the kind of galaxy he wanted her to grow up in. He thought about what it meant to be human, and about the values that his parents had taught him when he was a child on Earth. They had told him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear. They had told him that doing the right thing was often hard and sometimes dangerous, but that it was always worth it. They had told him that one person could make a difference if they were willing to try. Marcus took a deep breath and made his decision. He was going to the feast hall, and he was going to stop the assassination, and he was going to do it himself because there was no one else. He moved through the corridors as quickly as he could, and he avoided the guards by using the service passages that Yillis had shown him. The sounds of the feast grew louder as he approached, and he could hear music and voices and the clink of glasses. Being raised in toast, Marcus reached a service entrance to the great hall and paused to catch his breath and to prepare himself for what he was about to do. He thought about the consequences of his actions and knew that they would be severe. If he was wrong about the poison, then he would be arrested and executed for disrupting the sacred ceremony, and humanity would be disgraced. If he was right but failed to stop the assassination, then he would probably die anyway, and the queen would die with him. And even if he succeeded, he would be violating every protocol and tradition that the Valkyrie held sacred, and the consequences would be unpredictable. But Marcus had made his choice, and he was not going to turn back. Now he pushed open that service door and stepped into the great hall, and the scene before him took his breath away. 1,000 guests filled the room, and they were arranged according to rank and species in a complex pattern that reflected the hierarchy of the empire. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sat Queen Sci-Fi on her throne of crystal and light, and walking toward her, carried by 4 ceremonial bearers, was a golden plate bearing the Vethsarath sacred dish that was poisoned and would kill the queen if she tasted it. Marcus began to run. The great hall fell silent as the ceremonial bearers approached the throne with the Vethsarai held high above their heads. Queen Sci-Fi rose from her seat, and her ancient body moved with a grace that seemed to defy the weight of her countless years. Her silver eyes glowed with a soft light as she prepared to receive the sacred dish and perform the ritual that would renew the bonds of her empire. As entered species watched in reverent silence, and every eye in the room was fixed on the golden plate and the delicate creation that rested upon it. Somewhere in the crowd, a group of conspirators held their breath and waited for the moment when their plan would succeed and change the course of history. They had worked for years to reach this point, and they had sacrificed much, and they believed that what they were doing was necessary for the future of the Valkyrie race. They believed that Queen Sci-Fi had grown too soft and too accepting of lesser species, and that her tolerance was weakening the empire that their ancestors had built. They believed that a new ruler would restore the glory of the Valkyrie and push back the tide of change that threatened to overwhelm their ancient culture. And in just a few moments, the queen would take a bite of the Vethsarai and seal her own fate. Marcus ran through the crowd and pushed past delegates who shouted in surprise and outrage at his rudeness. He could see the golden plate getting closer to the throne, and he could see the queen reaching out her hands to receive it. Guards were moving to intercept him, and guests were scrambling out of his way, and the carefully ordered ceremony was dissolving into chaos. Marcus heard someone call his name, and he thought it might be Yillis. But he did not stop to look. He heard Ambassador Chun shouting at him to stop and demanding to know what he was doing. He heard the captain of the guard ordering his soldiers to seize the human who had escaped from custody. But Marcus did not slow down, because the only thing that mattered was reaching that plate before it reached the queen. The ceremonial bearers had stopped in confusion, and they did not know whether to continue toward the throne or to retreat from the madness that was unfolding around them. Queen Sci-Fi stood motionless on her platform and watched the human running toward her with an expression that was impossible to read. Marcus was almost there, and he could see the Vethsarai clearly now, and it looked beautiful and innocent and deadly. He lunged forward and grabbed the golden plate from the hands of the startled bearers, and the crowd gasped in horror. What he had just done was a crime, punishable by death. The Vethsarai was sacred, and only the queen was permitted to touch it, and by taking it, Marcus had committed an act of blasphemy that no Valkyrie would ever forgive. Guards surrounded him, and weapons were pointed at his chest, and voices demanded that he put down the plate and surrender. But Marcus did not put down the plate. Instead, he looked up at Queen Sci-Fi and spoke in a voice that carried across the silent hall. "This food is poisoned," he said, "and someone in this room wants you dead." The crowd erupted in outrage and disbelief, and guards moved forward to drag Marcus away. But the queen raised one slender hand, and everyone froze she descended from her platform and walked toward Marcus, and the crowd parted before her like water before a ship. She stopped in front of him and looked into his eyes, and Marcus felt the weight of her ancient gaze pressing down on his soul. "You make a serious accusation, human," she said. "And what proof do you offer?" Marcus opened his mouth to explain about the powder he had found, and about Senior Chef Vareth, and about the smell in the kitchen, but before he could speak, a voice rang out from the crowd. "He lies," the voice shouted, "and the human is trying to sabotage the ceremony and humiliate the Empire." Marcus turned and saw a Velthri noble pushing forward through the crowd, and he recognized the cold fury in the noble's silver eyes. This was Lord Savith, and Marcus had seen him before in the shadows of the palace, speaking with Vareth and looking pleased with himself. "He is a primitive creature, Lord Savith continued, and his species has no respect for our traditions, and he should be executed immediately as an example to all who would threaten the peace of the Empire." Other nobles joined their voices to Savith's, and soon the hall was filled with shouts demanding Marcus's death. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons, and Marcus knew that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. Queen Seraphiel listened to the shouting, and then raised her hand again, and silence fell. "You claim this fruit is poisoned," she said to Marcus, "and you must understand that I cannot take such an accusation lightly." Marcus said he understood. "You must also understand," she continued, "that if you are wrong, then you will die for the crime you have committed." Marcus said he understood that too. The queen studied him for a long moment, and something flickered in her ancient eyes that might have been curiosity or might have been respect. "Then prove it," she said, "and prove that what you say is true." Marcus looked down at the golden plate in his hands, and he looked at the beautiful, deadly dish that rested upon it, and he realized that there was only one way to prove the truth of his words. He looked up at the queen and at the crowd of hostile faces surrounding him, and at Lord Savith, whose expression had shifted from fury to something that looked almost like fear. Then Marcus did something that no one expected. He lifted the Vethsarai to his lips and took a bite. The taste was strange and exotic, and for a moment Marcus thought that perhaps he had been wrong about everything. Then the poison hit him. It started as a burning sensation in his throat and spread rapidly through his chest and into his limbs. His vision blurred, and his legs gave way, and he collapsed to the floor, still clutching the golden plate. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Marcus convulsed on the polished stone, and foam appeared at the corners of his mouth. Lord Savith's face went pale, and he took a step backward, as if trying to distance himself from what was happening. Other nobles, who had been shouting for Marcus's death moments ago, now stood frozen in shock and confusion. Queen Seraphiel knelt beside the fallen human, and her ancient face showed an emotion that few had ever seen there. "The human was right," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the hall. "Guards, seize Lord Savith, and anyone who tries to leave this room." Chaos erupted as soldiers moved through the crowd, and nobles tried to flee, and servants screamed and ran for the exits. Lord Savith drew a weapon from beneath his robes, but before he could use it, a Vaed Chauvin Morvethi guard struck him down with a single blow. Other conspirators were identified and captured as they tried to escape, and High Counselor Ravith appeared with a squad of loyal soldiers who had been waiting for this moment. Marcus saw none of this because he was lost in a world of pain and darkness and fire. The poison was destroying his body from the inside, and every nerve was screaming, and every breath was agony. He thought about Sarah and about the promise he had made to come home, and he felt tears running down his face because he knew he would not be able to keep that promise. He thought about his parents and about Earth and about all the things he would never see again. He thought about the stars and about how beautiful they had looked from the window of his transport ship when he first arrived at this world, and then he felt hands lifting him and voices speaking in languages he did not understand, and he was carried away from the great hall and into the medical wing of the Palace Valtteri physicians surrounded him and machines hummed and lights flashed, and someone was saying that human biology was different and that they did not know how to treat him. Marcus wanted to tell them that it was okay and that he had made his choice and that he did not regret it, but he could not speak. And he could not move, and all he could do was drift in and out of consciousness, while strangers worked desperately to save his life. Hours passed, or maybe days, and Marcus lost all sense of time. Sometimes he was aware of voices and lights and hands touching him, and sometimes he was floating in darkness with nothing but his memories for company. Dreamed about Sarah and about teaching her to ride a bicycle when she was 5 years old. Dreamed about his wife Elena, who had died 3 years ago in an accident that he still blamed himself for. He dreamed about the first time he saw an alien and how he had felt wonder instead of fear. He dreamed about all the choices he had made in his life, and all the paths he had taken, and all the moments that had led him to this place. And somewhere in those dreams he heard a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "Stay with us, human," the voice said, "and you are not done yet." Marcus did not know who was speaking, but he held on to that voice like a lifeline, and he fought against the darkness that was trying to pull him under. He was not ready to die. Had made a promise to his daughter, and he intended to keep it. The days that followed were a blur of pain and treatment and recovery. The Valtteri physicians worked around the clock to purge the poison from his system and repair the damage it had done. They learned that human biology was more resilient than they had expected, and that certain compounds in human blood actually helped neutralize the selenith. This discovery amazed them because no other species in the Empire had shown such natural resistance to the poison. Marcus survived, but his recovery was slow and difficult, and there were moments when the doctors thought they would lose him. High Counselor Raveth visited him every day and brought news of what was happening in the court. The conspiracy had been larger than anyone realized, and it had reached into the highest levels of Valtteri society. Lord Saveth and dozens of other nobles had been arrested and questioned, and the full scope of their plot had been revealed. They had planned to assassinate Queen Seraphiel and install a puppet ruler who would restore the old ways and push back against the reforms that had made the Empire more welcoming to other species. They had believed that humans and other newcomers were a threat to Valtteri culture, and that eliminating the Queen was the only way to save their way of life. But their plot had failed because of one human who had refused to look the other way. Raveth told Marcus that his actions had saved not just the Queen, but potentially millions of lives across the Empire. If the conspiracy had succeeded, the resulting civil war would have destroyed entire worlds. Marcus listened to these words, but he did not feel like a hero. He felt tired and weak, and he wanted nothing more than to go home and see his daughter again. But there was one more thing he had to do before he could leave. He had to face the Queen. 3 weeks after the Grand Concordance, Marcus woke to find Queen Seraphiel sitting beside his bed. He tried to rise and show proper respect, but she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and pressed him back down. "Rest, human," she said, "and you have earned the right to remain seated in my presence." Marcus looked at the ancient queen and saw something in her silver eyes that he had not expected. He saw gratitude and curiosity, and perhaps even affection. She was smaller than she had seemed on her throne, and up close, Marcus could see the fine lines that marked her pale skin and the weight of centuries that she carried. "You almost died," she said, "and my physicians tell me that no Valtteri would have survived what you went through." Marcus nodded and said that humans were stubborn creatures who did not know when to quit. The Queen smiled at this, and it was the first time Marcus had seen her smile. "I have ruled this empire for 400 years, she said, "and in that time no species has ever sacrificed for the Valtteri without expecting something in return." She paused and looked at Marcus with those ancient searching eyes. "But you ran into a room full of enemies and ate poison and nearly died, and you did all of this for a queen you had never met and a people who had treated you with contempt. Why?" Marcus thought about the question, and tried to find words that would make sense to someone who had lived for 4 centuries and ruled an empire of 100 worlds where I come from. He finally said, "We have a saying that you do not let someone die at the dinner table if you can help it." The Queen waited for him to continue it. "Does not matter if they invited you to the meal or not," Marcus said, "and it does not matter if they have been rude to you or ignored you or treated you like you do not belong. If you see something wrong and you can do something about it, then you do it. That is what it means to be human." Queen was silent for a long moment, and Marcus could not tell what she was thinking. Then she reached out and took his hand in hers, and her skin was cool and smooth and surprisingly soft. "I've lived a very long time," she said, "and I have seen species rise and fall, and I have watched empires crumble and new ones take their place. I thought I understood the galaxy and all the creatures in it, but you humans, you are something new." Marcus did not know what to say, so he said nothing. The Queen released his hand and rose from her chair and stood looking down at him with an expression that was both sad and hopeful. "You saved my life," she said, "and that is a debt I can never fully repay, but I can do this." She reached into her robes and withdrew a small crystal pendant that glowed with a soft inner light. "This is the seal of the sovereign," she said, "and whoever carries it is under my personal protection. From this day forward, the human species is no longer a vassal of the empire. You are allies and equals and friends." Marcus stared at the pendant and felt tears forming in his eyes. He thought about all the humans who had worked so hard to earn respect in the galactic community and who had been dismissed and ignored and treated as primitives. He thought about Sarah and the world she would inherit and the opportunities that would now be open to her. And he thought about the price he had paid and the promise he had almost been unable to keep. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. The Queen placed the pendant in his hand and closed his fingers around it. "Thank you, Marcus Cole," she said, "and for reminding an old queen that courage and kindness can still be found in the most unexpected places." She left the room, and Marcus lay in his bed and held the pendant close to his chest and wept. 2 days later, Marcus boarded an Imperial ship that would carry him home to Earth. High Counselor Ravith came to see him off, and she thanked him again for everything he had done. Aeolus was there too, and she had tears in her large brown eyes. And she told Marcus that she would never forget him. Ambassador Chun was there looking ashamed, and he apologized for not believing Marcus when it mattered. Marcus forgave him because holding grudges was not the human way. The ship rose from the landing platform and climbed through the violet clouds, and Marcus watched through the window as Veltharus Prime shrank behind him. He thought about everything that had happened and everything that would happen next. The galaxy would learn what humans had done, and some would admire them, and some would fear them, and some would hate them, but none of them would ever dismiss humans as primitive newcomers again. Marcus thought about Sarah and imagined the look on her face when he walked through the door of their home. He thought about the gift he was bringing her from the Velthari home world. It was a small crystal flower that changed colors in the light, and it was beautiful. But it was not the most important thing he was bringing home. The most important thing was the knowledge that he had kept his promise. He had gone out into the galaxy, and he had done something that mattered, and he had come home safely just as he said he would. And he had changed the course of history with nothing more than his curiosity and his stubbornness and his belief that doing the right thing was always worth the cost. The stars stretched out before the ship like scattered diamonds on black velvet, and Marcus smiled. Somewhere ahead, Earth was waiting. Somewhere ahead, his daughter was waiting, and somewhere in the vast reaches of space, a new word was spreading from world to world and species to species. Humans, they were strange and stubborn, and they never gave up, and they had just proven that they belonged among the stars. The future was uncertain and full of challenges, but Marcus was not worried. After all, he had faced poison and death and an angry empire, and he had survived. Whatever came next, he would face it the same way. He faced everything else, the human way.